This is my farm on the flat map, but it wasn't always like this. I started with absolutely nothing, yet I managed to build my own farm that can generate tens of thousands of dollars every month. Today, we'll go through all the stages of development, from day 1, when we had nothing, to day 100, with a large and thriving farm. If you're interested, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. When we spawned on the map, there was nothing but grass around us. The only structures were a machinery store and a selling point where we could earn money by selling various products. But right now, we have absolutely nothing. Just a handheld scythe and a pitchfork. That means there's only one option: selling grass. Luckily, there was plenty of it around. So let's not waste time talking and get straight to work. First, I grabbed the scythe and started mowing the grass. Since I had to do it manually, the process was exhausting and required a lot of effort. Once I had cut several rows, I switched to the pitchfork and began gathering the grass to sell it. A full load earned me just $25. Not much, but it was the only way to make money for now. After selling all the grass I had mowed, I managed to save up a little over $300. Since the store was nearby, I decided to stop by and see what I could buy to speed up the work, which was now our main goal. A small wheelbarrow caught my attention. It would allow me to transport more grass at once. It cost only $200, so after purchasing it, I still had some money left. Bringing the wheelbarrow to the spot where I had been mowing, I picked up the scythe again and got back to work. This time, I managed to cut significantly more than before. Using the wheelbarrow and the pitchfork, I immediately started collecting and selling the grass. Thanks to this new purchase, the process sped up a little, but it still made a difference. Now, each trip earned me a little over $60. Already much better than before. By the evening, I had finished my work. From all the grass I had sold, I managed to earn just under $1,500. Since the sun was already setting, I decided to spend some of the money on shelter. I chose a small tent. It was the best option for now. It was inexpensive and allowed me to spend the next few nights near the store. After setting up the tent, I went to rest after a long, hard day. The next morning, the entire map was covered in thick fog, but that didn't stop me. Money doesn't earn itself. The first thing I did was visit the store to check if there were any mowers available within my budget. Unfortunately, there was nothing suitable. The only option was a small mower that cost over $2,000. I decided that I would definitely buy it, but for now, I didn't have enough money. That left me with only one choice: to keep working. I grabbed the scythe and started mowing again. After 8 hours of hard work, I had finally saved up enough. Without wasting time, I headed straight to the store and bought the long-awaited mower. Even though it was already late, I couldn't wait to test it out. I started the engine and cut some grass around the area where I had been mowing before. The new mower worked much faster than the handheld scythe, which was no surprise. It had a powerful engine. After testing it out, I parked it next to my tent and went to rest. On the third day, I got into my mower, prepared for a productive session, and set a goal to cut much more grass than before, so I could focus solely on collecting and selling later. I spent the entire day doing this. Soon, the area I had mowed was massive, and I even started to doubt whether I'd be able to sell that much grass. But first, I needed to finish mowing all of it, so I continued, working in circles before switching to straight rows. By the evening, I had managed to mow a little over half of what I had planned. That was already quite a lot, so I decided to stop for now. Since it was still light outside, I figured I could do some work collecting and selling the grass. After selling a few wheelbarrow loads, I went to rest. The next morning, I started thinking about how I could speed up the process even more. That's when I noticed that my mower had a small hitch. An idea immediately came to mind. If I bought a small trailer, I could transport the freshly cut grass directly with the mower. With that thought, I headed to the store to find a suitable trailer. The only one that fit in terms of size cost $2,000. Setting this as my next goal, I hurried back, grabbed the wheelbarrow and pitchfork, and started selling the grass I had mowed the day before. To my surprise, the price of grass had increased slightly, meaning I was now earning more per load. Great news! I kept working hard, and after just 2 hours, I had saved up $2,000. Before buying the trailer, I decided to sell my wheelbarrow since I wouldn't need it anymore. I also got rid of the scythe, as it was no longer necessary after getting the new mower. Now I could finally get behind the wheel of my mower, attach the trailer, and head out to the field. Collecting grass became much more convenient. Now I could simply drive the loaded trailer to the selling point, earning money much faster than before. With this new upgrade, my income increased significantly, as I was now making just over $200 per full trailer. The only thing left to do was keep collecting and selling grass to save up for even more powerful equipment. By the end of the day, I had nearly finished transporting half of all the mowed grass. There was only a small portion left that I wanted to deliver before wrapping up. I continued working, fully loaded the trailer, and took the grass to sell. A little bit of grass was still left, so I decided to pile it up in one spot to sell the rest the next day. By the end of the day, I had earned just over $6,000. It was finally time to rest so I could continue working the next day. However, when I woke up in the morning, I saw that it was raining heavily. Since I had no shelter for my equipment, I decided to build a small shed and parked my mower under it to protect it from the bad weather. With the rain still pouring and nothing else to do, I decided to visit the store and check out the equipment that might be useful in the future. A small tractor and a tedder caught my attention. Using it, I could turn grass into hay and sell it for a higher price. After looking around, I returned home to wait out the rain. As soon as it stopped, I got back to work, continuing to collect and sell grass while steadily working towards my next upgrades. The next day, I focused entirely on making money, selling grass, and saving up for my first tractor. By the end of the day, I had earned just over $12,000. As planned, I headed to the store and purchased the equipment I had chosen. The total cost came to just under $9,000. Returning to my campsite, I parked the new equipment next to my tent. Satisfied with my progress, I went to rest. Tomorrow, even more work awaits. The next morning, I decided to move farther away from the store. With each passing day, we were acquiring more equipment, and I didn't want to clutter the store's surroundings. Besides, in the future, we would be creating much larger fields, so it was better to start building the farm in a convenient location from the beginning. I got into the mower and first cleared a path leading to the site where our future farm would be. Then it was time to collect the grass. I hopped into the tractor, attached the trailer, and got to work. However, as I pulled the trailer out from under the shed, I noticed that our old trailer was too small for the new tractor. So I sold it and bought a larger one that fit the tractor perfectly. After attaching it, I got back to work. Once all the mowed grass was collected, I focused on building the road. Then I moved the tent and the shed to the new location, followed by transferring all the equipment there. Now, we had much more space to work with and expand the farm. At the new location, I decided to set up a large hayfield. The grass from this area would be tedded and turned into hay, which could then be sold at a better price. Once all the grass was mowed, I got into the tractor and began tedding it using our tedder. The job took several hours, but eventually all the grass was processed. Now, all that was left was to wait for it to dry and turn into hay. On the 7th day, the hay was ready, and its price turned out to be quite high. I decided not to waste any time and sell it as soon as possible. To speed up the process, I headed to the store and bought a windrower, which would help gather the hay into neat rows. After attaching it to the tractor, I drove to the field and got to work. Now, collecting hay would be much faster. After finishing the job, I stored the equipment properly and went to rest. Tomorrow is a new day with new challenges ahead. The next morning, I got into the tractor and started collecting the straw using a pitchfork. Once the trailer was full, I took it to sell. Each full trailer of straw earned me just over $1,500, which was quite decent. By the time all the straw was collected, our balance had grown to just over $10,000. I decided to invest this money into improving the farm. I built a road leading to our new field and expanded the lot, as there was no longer enough space for all the equipment. Additionally, I set up a repair and modification area for our machinery, which would make future maintenance much easier. Since we still had some money left, I decided to buy a more efficient mower. To do this, I got into our old one, drove to the store, sold it, and purchased a new 2-meter hay mower for $1,500. The only thing left was to transport the new purchase back to the farm. I returned home, took the tractor, and delivered the new mower to its designated spot. With that, all the planned work for the day was completed. We even managed to expand the farm a little. So despite feeling tired, I was in a great mood. With those thoughts, I went to rest. Ready for another productive day ahead, I returned to work after several months, waiting for the grass to regrow. Just like before, I started mowing it, then tedding it, and finally gathering it into one large windrow to make loading easier. After that, I began transporting and selling the hay. By the end of the day, our balance had grown to just over $18,000. I figured this amount would be useful for purchasing new equipment to help increase the farm's profitability. It was a successful day, so I went to rest, preparing for new challenges ahead. Waking up the next morning, I decided it was time to organize another hay harvest, this time even bigger than our previous one. Besides that, I started thinking about buying a baler to make loading hay easier and allow us to store it until prices were at their highest. I got into the tractor and headed to the store. The selection of balers was small, especially considering our limited budget. There was only one option that fit, so I bought it. After attaching it to the tractor, I drove back to the farm. Since the hay wasn't ready yet, I left the baler next to the tent and started preparing for the new hay harvest. First, I attached the mower and cleared a path to the future field. Then, I marked its boundaries and began mowing the grass. Once the mowing was done, I swapped the mower for the tedder and started turning the grass to help it dry faster. The work lasted until evening, so all I could do was rest and wait for the grass to dry. However, the next morning, I was met with an unpleasant surprise. It was pouring rain. Because of this, the hay got wet, and I had to wait even longer for it to dry completely. By the evening, I rushed to check if the grass had dried. Fortunately, it was fully dry, but there was no time to waste. According to the forecast, more rain was expected in the coming months. So, I immediately grabbed the windrower to gather the hay into neat rows. After finishing that, I returned to the farm, picked up the baler, and began baling the hay. Since our baler produced small bales, we ended up with a lot of them, but I didn't think that would be too much of a problem. During the process, I noticed that I had missed some hay, so I had to run back to the farm, grab a pitchfork, and gather the leftovers into one pile. After collecting all the hay, I continued baling, but after a while, the work stopped stopped. The baling twine had run out. I had to attach the trailer and drive to the store for more. To avoid making frequent trips, I decided to buy an entire pallet of twine. Returning to the farm, I loaded the twine into the baler and resumed work. With time running short, I had to keep working late into the night. Rain could start at any moment. Once the baling was finally done, I put all the used equipment away and at last went to rest. Waking up in the morning, I immediately checked the weather forecast. It turned out that the rain was expected to start after noon, so I had to collect and store the bales under cover before then. Since we didn't have a storage shelter yet, the first thing I focused on was building one. Before that, though, I decided to expand the farm's territory to make enough space for the new storage area. I built a small shelter. I figured it would be enough to store the bales. However, in case all the bales didn't fit under it, I had a backup plan. I placed several pallets nearby where I could stack any extra bales. After finishing construction, I attached our trailer to the tractor and modified it for transporting bales. Now everything was ready and I got to work. Time was running out, so I had to act fast. After loading a full trailer of bales, I began stacking them under the shelter, trying to fit as many as possible. Unfortunately, to my disappointment, I couldn't stack them neatly. The bales kept shifting, so I ended up just piling them in as tightly as I could. Once the shelter was completely filled, there were still some bales left on the trailer, as well as a few more scattered across the hayfield. I decided to collect all of them, load them onto the trailer, and leave them there until I could sell them. After gathering the remaining bales, I had another fully loaded trailer. Once the work was done, I parked the trailer next to the shelter and sold the pallets that we didn't end up using. Then I built a road leading to the new hayfield. Now, all that was left was to wait for the hay prices to peak. On the 18th day, I woke up and saw that the price of hay was quite high. That meant it was time to sell. I attached the trailer filled with bales and headed to the selling point. The first load brought in nearly $5,000. I spent the entire day transporting and selling bales. By noon, our balance had reached just under $24,000. I decided to invest this money into improving the farm. Since we were running out of space for equipment, I built a spacious shelter where we could store it. Additionally, I fenced off the farm, relocated the workshop, and replaced the tent with a small house. The finishing touch was landscaping. Now, the farm looked much cozier and more organized. After completing all the work, I was satisfied with the results. I think this is a great place to wrap up today's progress. Waking up in the morning, I looked outside. It was March. That meant today marked the 18th day of our progress on the flat map. Today we would primarily focus on silage production. Of course, for that, we needed to build a silage pit. I had already picked a great spot, right behind our equipment shed. So, without wasting time, I switched to construction mode and got to work. First, I cleared the area of grass that was in the way, and then I installed the silage pit. It cost a little over $4,000, and for now, it should be enough. Next, I had to build an access road so the tractor could easily drive in and unload grass. In the end, we created a small but convenient area for silage production. With that done, it was time to start filling the pit. First, we needed to cut a sufficient amount of grass. I got into the tractor, attached the mower, and headed to the hayfield. This time, I decided to mow just a small amount of grass to test how much we could earn and whether it was even worth spending too much time on it. After mowing, I needed to collect the grass. To make the process easier, I used a windrower, which neatly arranged the grass into rows for easier collection. Once everything was ready, I realized that we needed more modern equipment. Picking up grass manually with a pitchfork was no longer efficient. So I set the windrower aside and headed to the store. There, I found a suitable forage pickup, which cost a little over $2,500. Since we already had a trailer, there was no point in buying another one. With the new equipment purchased, I returned to the farm, detached the pickup, and worked on modifying the trailer. I needed to adapt it for transporting grass, and while I was at it, I decided to increase its capacity by adding side extensions. Now, the trailer could hold up to 9 cubic meters of different crops, which was quite impressive. While I was making these upgrades, it started to rain, but that didn't stop me from working. I hooked up the equipment and headed to the field to collect the grass. The new pickup made the process significantly easier and faster. Within just a couple of minutes, our upgraded trailer was completely full. If I had used a pitchfork, this would have taken much longer. Next, I headed to the silage pit to unload the grass. That's when I realized that to open the trailer's side gates, the tractor needed to be directly attached. That meant I had to disconnect the pickup each time and then reattach the trailer to the tractor. This took up some extra time, but it was still much faster than loading everything manually with a pitchfork. After collecting all the remaining grass, I ended up with another 1.5 trailer loads, which I also dumped into the silage pit. Now, all that was left was to compact the silage and cover it with plastic, so the fermentation process could begin. I got into the tractor and carefully drove over the forage multiple times to pack it down. Once everything was properly compacted, I returned all the equipment to its designated spots. Since there was no more space under the main shelter, I had to park the tractor under the hay storage shed. Only then did I remember that I had forgotten to cover the silage with plastic. So I had to go back and seal it properly. With that done, all that was left was to wait for the silage to fully ferment. In the meantime, I could finally take a well-earned break, which is exactly what I did. 2 days passed, and our silage was fully ready for sale. However, there was one problem. We needed a way to load it. I decided to buy a shovel and load the silage into the trailer manually. I hopped into the tractor, attached the trailer, and headed to the store to get the necessary tool. The shovel was quite cheap, only $26. I tossed it into the trailer and drove back to the silage pit. Once I arrived, I grabbed the shovel and started loading silage into the trailer, bit by bit. This was a slow job, so it took some time. But in the end, after filling the trailer completely, I was ready to head off and sell it. Arriving at the selling point, I opened the trailer's gate and unloaded our silage. As a result, we earned just over $3,000, which was quite good considering the low time investment and the fact that the price wasn't even the best. I started thinking this was actually a pretty profitable business. Maybe it was worth expanding silage production on a larger scale. But first, I had to sell the remaining silage. While loading the next batch, I noticed that quite a bit of forage had spilled outside the silage pit. This had happened because, during the compaction process, some of the material had been pushed out. Not wanting to waste any resources, I grabbed the shovel, collected the scattered forage, and then got back into the tractor to head for another sale. Just like last time, we earned a little over $3,000 for a full trailer, bringing our total income to nearly $9,000. That was an excellent result, especially considering that all of this silage had been produced from just a small hay harvest. On my way back to the farm, I decided that since silage production was proving to be so profitable, it should become our main focus. Since our baler was now unnecessary, I decided to sell it and use the money to build a larger silage pit and buy better equipment. Selling the baler brought in almost $9,000, bringing our total balance to around $18,000. On my way home, I thought about the fact that our silage pit was already nearly half filled with forage from the last batch. That meant the smartest approach would be to completely fill it up sell all the silage at once, and then demolish it to build a much larger one. This idea seemed pretty solid to me. So when I arrived at the farm, I attached the mower to the tractor and headed to the hayfield. After mowing, I windrowed the grass, collected it, and dumped it into the silage pit. The next step was compaction. After carefully compacting everything, we ended up with just over 14,000 litres of forage. I covered the pit with plastic, hopped into the tractor, and parked all the equipment in its proper place. Because for today, the work was done. Fermentation would take some time, so until it was ready, I could finally take a well-earned break. Another 2 days passed, and our silage was ready for sale once again. However, when I got into the tractor, I noticed that the fuel was almost empty. That meant I had to go buy some diesel. I figured there was just enough fuel left to make it to the store, so I headed there. At the store, I noticed that I could purchase a fuel barrel for only $280. That seemed like a great option, so I bought it. Then I drove up to the barrel and refueled the tractor. With a full tank, I returned to the farm and prepared to transport the silage. Just like last time, I pulled up to the silage pit with the trailer, grabbed the shovel, and started loading. After filling the first trailer, I took it to sell, earning a little over $3,000. Selling the remaining silage brought our balance to just over $22,000. Now it was time to build a new, larger silage pit to replace the old one. First, I sold the old pit for $2,000. Then I decided to construct a cement pit for $12,500, which would be able to hold much more forage. In addition, I built an access road leading to the new pit. Once construction was complete, I had to move the spilled forage into the new silage pit. Grabbing the shovel once again, I got to work. After transferring everything, it was finally time to start filling the new pit. The first step was cutting a massive amount of grass, so I got into the tractor, attached the mower, and headed to the hayfield. This hayfield turned out to be truly massive. There was more than enough grass to completely fill the new pit. The mowing process itself took a lot of time. By 5 o'clock in the evening, I had managed to cut most of it, but since it was getting dark, I decided to stop for the day. I parked all the equipment in its designated spots and went to rest, ready to continue working tomorrow. The next day, heavy rain fell, forcing me to wait until it stopped. According to the forecast, the rain was expected to end by 10 o'clock. Sure enough, once the rain stopped, I resumed mowing the grass. After some time, the mowing was finally completed. There was a lot of grass, so I wasted no time and immediately attached the windrower to gather it into neat rows for easier transportation to the silage pit. A few hours later, all the grass had been neatly arranged into rows. However, during the process, I realized an important issue. Our silage pit had only one entrance. This meant that maneuvering the trailer inside would be inconvenient, and with side unloading, stacking the grass evenly inside the pit would be extremely difficult. To fix this, I headed to the store to look for a more suitable trailer, preferably one with rear unloading. At the store, I found a trailer priced at $13,000 that could hold 12 cubic meters. Luckily, we had just enough money, so I decided to buy it. It met all our requirements and even had a larger capacity than our previous trailer, which should speed up grass transportation significantly. I attached the new trailer to the tractor and headed back to the hayfield. There, I hooked up the forage pickup and began collecting the grass. But immediately, I ran into a serious problem. Because of its larger size, the new trailer was taller than the previous one, and the forage pickup simply couldn't reach its bed. That meant I couldn't load grass into it. To be honest, at that moment, I was really frustrated. At first, I considered modifying the trailer in our workshop, but the upgrade would cost $2,000, and we didn't have that much money at the moment. So I had no choice but to return to the store and sell the trailer. I managed to get a little over $11,000 for it, and then started looking for a new option. This time, I took all my previous mistakes into account and picked a trailer for $9,000. However, it had a smaller capacity, only 8 cubic meters. But we didn't have a choice, so I had to take it. I hooked it up to the tractor, returned to the farm, and resumed collecting the grass. Since the new trailer was smaller, I had to unload it frequently, which significantly increased the time needed to complete the job. However, the one positive aspect was that now we could easily unload forage directly at the back of the silage pit, ensuring a much more efficient distribution inside. Since we had a large amount of forage, I made sure to thoroughly compact the mass after each unloading to fit as much as possible into the silage pit. By the time I had transported about half of the grass from the hayfield, the sun was already starting to set. On top of that, I was exhausted from the day's work, so I decided to pause and get some rest. Tomorrow, I would finish transporting the remaining grass and prepare the silage pit for fermentation. It was already the 24th day of our progress, and I continued working in the hayfield, finishing the transportation of all the grass. Once everything had been delivered, I parked the forage pickup and trailer in their designated spots. Then I got into the tractor and headed to the silage pit to compact the forage. As I drove back and forth, the mass gradually became denser, but at one point, while climbing onto the pile of forage, my tractor bottomed out and got stuck. It refused to move, so I had to grab a shovel and dig out the wheels to free it. After clearing away all the obstructing forage, I got back into the driver's seat and resumed compacting. This time, I was much more careful to avoid getting stuck again. Since we had a large amount of forage, the compaction process took quite a bit of time. However, I eventually managed to complete it, and our forage was fully packed down. The only thing left to do was cover it with plastic. In the end, we had a little over 110,000 liters of forage, an impressive amount, and I was very pleased with the result. This volume would allow us to earn a significant sum. Now, all that was left was to wait for the forage to go through the fermentation process and turn into silage. Additionally, since we had so much of it, I wanted to sell it at the best possible price. So I decided to wait until the price per 1,000 liters reached its peak. By the time that happened, the silage would be fully ready. So I went to rest while keeping an eye on market prices. Exactly 1 year later, the price of silage was at a level I was completely satisfied with, so I decided to sell it. Since the volume was enormous, loading it manually didn't make sense, so I headed to the store and purchased an auger conveyor. After hooking it up to the tractor, I drove to our silage pit. Once everything was set up, I started loading silage into the trailer. Thanks to the auger, the process was much faster and more efficient. After filling the first trailer, I headed to the selling point. It earned me nearly $3,000, which was quite a decent sum. I spent the rest of the day transporting silage for sale. By the time the silage pit was completely emptied, our balance had grown by $43,000, which was a fantastic result and made me very happy. We have now spent 36 days on this flat map, and I think this is a great place to wrap up for today. Waking up in the morning, I saw that the weather was quite nice, though a light rain was expected later. Today marked the 37th day of our survival on the flat map, and I plan to create our first field. In the afternoon, I intended to plant canola, as its price was relatively high compared to other crops. I already had a rough idea of where to place the field. I initially thought about creating it where our hayfield used to be, so I got into the tractor and headed to the store to buy soil cultivation equipment, as we didn't have any yet. In general, we lacked proper machinery for field work, but I hoped to acquire more over time. Arriving at the store, I started browsing for the right equipment. A small subsoiler caught my eye. It was reasonably priced and a perfect fit for our small tractor. The choice was obvious, so I bought it. It cost us just over $1,000. After attaching it to the tractor, I headed back to the farm. Once I arrived, I took another look at the area and realized that it would be more convenient to place the field closer to the farm. Switching to construction mode, I began marking the boundaries of the future field. I decided to make it long and narrow, so that the equipment would spend less time turning during sowing and harvesting. With the layout set, I got into the tractor and started plowing the land. I tried to keep the field as even as possible. It would be much easier and more enjoyable to work on that way. Once the main area was plowed, I worked on smoothing out the edges to give it a neat appearance. When I finished, I stepped back to admire the result. It was a fairly large and well-shaped field. The next step was building a road around it to make it easier for machinery to move around. I laid out a road along almost the entire boundary, ensuring convenient access from any side. Additionally, to enhance the farm's appearance, I planted some trees, which made it look much nicer. By this time, the rain had started, so I decided to postpone sowing until tomorrow. For today, it was time to take a well-earned rest. Waking up in the morning, I already knew for sure that today we would be planting canola on our field. But for that, we needed the right equipment, so I immediately got into the tractor and headed toward the store. Upon arrival, I began reviewing the available seeders that fit our budget. We had 4 options to choose from, but I decided to buy the cheapest one. Right now, saving money was crucial since we still had expenses ahead for herbicides and fertilizers, which wouldn't be cheap. In addition to the seeder, I also needed to buy seeds. Once I had everything necessary, I attached the seeder to the tractor and filled it with seeds. With that done, it was time to return to the farm. Arriving at the field, I immediately started planting canola. Even though the seeder wasn't very large, the work didn't take too long, which was a pleasant surprise. Now, all that was left was to wait for the seeds to sprout. With nothing else to do in the meantime, I returned home, parked the seeder and tractor in their places, and went to rest. The next day, the first thing I did was rush to check on our field. There, I saw that the canola had already sprouted, but along with it, a lot of weeds had also appeared, which needed to be removed immediately. To deal with them, I needed a weeder, so I headed to the store to buy one. After selecting a model that was best suited for our tractor, I made the purchase and drove back to the field to begin weeding. The work was progressing quite quickly, and most of the weeds disappeared under the weeder's blades. However, during the process, I noticed a section in the middle of the field where the canola hadn't sprouted at all. That was a bit disappointing, but I hoped it wouldn't significantly impact the overall yield. After finishing the weeding, I saw that some weeds still remained on the field, ones that the weeder couldn't remove. To get rid of them, I needed to use herbicides, so I headed to the store to buy a sprayer. Upon arriving, I checked the available models. The only one that fit within our budget cost $6,000. I had no choice but to buy it, since all the other options were far too expensive. I also purchased herbicides to treat the field. After filling the sprayer with herbicides, I ran into an unexpected problem. The tractor's front wheels lifted off the ground as soon as the sprayer was attached. I wasn't sure what to do since we didn't have the money for a more powerful tractor or a different sprayer. Then I decided to try filling the tank only partially, just 300 liters. This worked. The tractor remained stable, and I was able to head to the field. However, when I reached the farm's gate, I encountered yet another issue. The sprayer was too wide to fit through the entrance. At that moment, I regretted choosing this model, but there was no point in getting frustrated. Instead, I decided to build a direct road leading straight to our field to avoid passing through the farmyard. Once the road was completed, I was finally able to reach the field with ease. When I unfolded the sprayer and started the treatment, I felt relieved. It had been quite a hassle getting to this point. The sprayer worked perfectly. The herbicides successfully eliminated even the weeds that the weeder couldn't remove. That was a huge relief. Thanks to its wide coverage, I managed to treat the entire field in just 2 passes. However, just before finishing, the herbicide ran out, forcing me to make another trip to the store for more. Once the field was completely cleared of weeds, it was time to apply fertilizers. I went back to the store, bought fertilizers, and refilled the sprayer. Then I returned to the field and evenly spread the fertilizer across the entire area. Now our field was fully weed-free and fertilized, which should significantly boost our canola yield. Back at the farm, I realized that the sprayer still wouldn't fit inside the yard, so I decided to leave it temporarily at the entrance after preparing a designated spot for it. Now, all that was left was to wait for the harvest to ripen. In the meantime, I could finally take a well-earned break. Our canola had been growing for 7 months, and by July it was fully ripe. That meant it was finally time to begin harvesting. However, I needed the right equipment, so I headed to the store. There, I found a small harvester attachment that could be connected to a tractor. It wasn't too expensive, so I decided to buy it since we didn't have enough money for a full-sized combine yet. I just hoped that our tractor would be powerful enough to pull it. Arriving at the field, I started harvesting and was pleasantly surprised. The machine collected canola efficiently, and the tractor wasn't even operating at full capacity. However, I soon noticed an issue. The unloading auger of the harvester was quite low, meaning it probably wouldn't be able to reach the trailer. While the grain tank was filling up, I had some time to think about how to solve this problem. I decided to prepare a small storage area where I could unload the harvested canola and later transfer it to the trailer using the auger conveyor we had previously bought for silage. Switching to construction mode, I set up a compact storage area for temporary grain storage. It looked just right for the amount of harvest our field would produce. Once that was done, I got back into the tractor and started unloading the harvester's grain tank. After emptying the tank, I resumed harvesting, periodically unloading canola onto the prepared storage area. Once the entire field had been harvested, I was left with a sizable pile of canola. Now, I needed to load it into the trailer. I drove back to the farm to park the harvester and pick up the necessary loading equipment. However, as I approached the gate, I realized that the harvester couldn't fit through. I had no choice but to remove a small section of the fence to allow larger machinery to enter the farm freely in the future. Now I could also finally move the sprayer inside the farmyard. With that done, I hooked up the auger conveyor and headed back to the field. After positioning the trailer, I began loading the canola. Bit by bit, the trailer filled up, and by the end, it was almost completely loaded. However, I decided not to sell the harvest just yet, as the price of canola was too low. So I parked the trailer under the shelter, stored the auger in its place, and began waiting for the price to rise to a more profitable level. On the 50th day of our survival, the price of canola was quite high, so it was finally time to head to the selling point. After selling our entire harvest, we earned nearly $13,500, a pretty solid profit. With the money, I decided to build a few greenhouses to generate a small but steady income each month. To fully automate the watering process, I also purchased water tanks with an automatic supply system. Each tank cost $5,000, but this investment meant I wouldn't have to worry about irrigation anymore. After finishing the construction, we now had a place to grow rice seedlings, which could later be sold at the store for a good price. Additionally, I decided to plant canola on our field again, but before that, the soil needed cultivation, so I headed to the store and purchased a small cultivator. Back at the farm, I got to work on preparing the soil. Since you've already seen the planting process before, I won't go into too much detail. I'll just skip ahead to when the field was fully seeded and fertilized. And there we have it. Our canola is growing once again. This time, I decided to spray the field with herbicides in advance before the first sprouts appeared, to prevent weeds from interfering with crop development. Now, all that's left is to wait for the harvest to ripen. With that, today's work is done, and it's time to rest. 7 months passed, and our canola had grown once again. It was time to start harvesting. I followed the same process as before, and soon completed the harvest. Then, I loaded the canola into the trailer and set off to sell it. However, this time, the yield was lower, and the price wasn't as high as before. In the end, I received just under $9,000. Despite this, the money was still useful, as I needed to buy a trailer for transporting pallets of rice seedlings produced in our greenhouses. Over time, a significant number of pallets had accumulated, so I purchased a small auto-loading trailer to simplify and speed up the transportation process. On my way back from the store to the farm, I also picked up several barrels of fertilizer, herbicides, seeds, and a diesel barrel that had been left near the store. However, some barrels remained, and I planned to pick them up on my next trip. For now, I unloaded the materials I had brought back and set off to sell the pallets of seedlings. By the evening, I had transported all the pallets, increasing our balance to $14,500. This was an excellent result, as our greenhouses had fully paid for themselves, and we had barely invested any additional funds into them. The only task left was to transport the remaining barrels still at the store. I delivered them to the farm and carefully placed them under the shelter. After that, I headed to our greenhouses to build a few more, as I realized that this was a fairly profitable venture that required minimal effort. Once the construction of a new greenhouse was complete, I thought it would be a good idea to refill our silage pit so it wouldn't sit idle and could continue generating profit. So I attached the mower to the tractor and headed to the hayfield to harvest a fresh batch of grass for silage production. After mowing a large section of grass, I immediately loaded it into the silage pit, carefully compacted it, and covered it with plastic. With that done, I went to rest while waiting for the silage to ferment. 2 hours later, the fermentation process was complete, and we had 132,000 liters of silage, a truly impressive amount. During the same time, the greenhouses had also produced a significant number of pallets with rice seedlings. Since we had a lot of work to do today, there was no time to waste. I immediately started transporting the pallets for sale. By the time I was done, I had earned just over $6,000. Now it was time to start selling the silage. I spent the entire day loading and transporting it to the selling point. By the evening, our silage pit was completely empty, and our balance had grown to just over $608,000, the largest amount we had ever earned so far. The remaining forage that didn't fit into the silage pit was collected in the trailer and unloaded back into the pit. Then, I parked all the equipment in its proper place and went to rest after a productive day. On the 57th day, I decided to spend part of our earnings on building another greenhouse and adding some decorative plants around the farm. The total cost for these upgrades was only $8,000, which seemed like a reasonable amount. Additionally, I wanted to try forestry. To do that, I needed to visit the store and purchase a tree planter along with seedlings. After heading to the store, I bought everything necessary. However, when I tried to attach the planter to our tractor, I realized that it was too large and heavy causing the tractor to tip forward. At that moment, I knew it was time to buy a new, more powerful tractor, as our old one was no longer handling many tasks efficiently. I found a suitable model for $14,000, then upgraded it by adding dual wheels and a cabin for a more comfortable working experience. The modifications increased the total cost to $17,000. This tractor was significantly more powerful than our previous one. Since we no longer needed the old tractor, I decided to sell it. Now I could finally get behind the wheel of our new tractor and attach the planter. It handled the weight with ease, so I headed back to the farm. However, as I approached the farm's gate, I noticed that the tractor barely fit through. In the future, I would need to address this and create a proper entrance for larger equipment. Now, I could start preparing for tree planting. First, I selected a location. I decided that the best option would be the area behind our equipment sheds. Once I had chosen the spot, I built a road and marked the planting locations. Then, I fenced off the area and decorated it with plants. Now everything was set and I got to work. Planting the trees didn't take too long, but partway through, I realized that I didn't have enough seedlings, so I had to make another trip to the store to buy an additional batch. Once everything was planted, I sold the planter since we wouldn't need it anymore, and it was quite expensive. After that, I returned to the farm and started thinking about creating another field. However, when I attached our old subsoiler to the new tractor, it looked ridiculously small. It was clearly not suited for this machine, so I decided to sell it and buy something larger. At the store, I chose a new subsoiler for $7,500. It was a perfect match for our tractor, which made me very happy. After purchasing it, I attached it to the tractor and headed back to the farm. Once there, I switched to construction mode and began marking the boundaries of the new field. After that, I started plowing the land. By the end of the day, the new field was fully completed. I think today was incredibly productive. We created another field, planted several batches of tree seedlings, and bought a new, more powerful tractor. It was the 58th day of our progress, and I started the day by working on our fields. One of them had not yet been cultivated, so that was my first priority. I got into our tractor, attached the cultivator, and headed to the field to begin work. The cultivation process took some time, but overall, the tractor handled the job well. With that task done, it was time to move on to the next stage, planting canola. Now that we had 2 fields, the process took much longer than I expected. Managing multiple plots at once required more concentration and attention to detail. Despite this, I successfully completed the seeding, meaning it was time to protect our future crops. Next, I had to spray the fields with herbicides to eliminate weeds and prevent them from spreading further. If this wasn't done on time, weeds could start choking the crops, leading to a lower harvest. That was something I couldn't afford to let happen, so I went to fetch our sprayer. After filling it almost to the top with herbicides, I headed to the fields. Our sprayer was quite large, and thanks to its wide coverage, I finished this task much faster than seeding. It's always nice when good equipment helps save time and improve efficiency. The next crucial step was fertilizing the fields. This would significantly boost the crop yield, which was especially important when working with large-scale production. Using the same sprayer but now filled with fertilizer, I treated both fields. By this point, I had gotten quite comfortable with the equipment and completed the job without any major issues. Now, our fields were fully prepared. Seeding was done, weeds were eliminated, and fertilizers had been applied. All that was left was to wait for the harvest to ripen. To be honest, I was quite exhausted. The day had been productive and full of hard work, but it's days like this that bring real satisfaction from the progress made. Since I had accomplished a lot today, I decided to call it a day and get some rest. 7 days later, our harvest was fully ripe, and a large number of pallets with rice seedlings had also accumulated, ready to be sold. There was plenty of work to do today, so I started by getting into the tractor, attaching the trailer, and heading to the greenhouses. There, I carefully loaded the pallets and drove to the selling point. The transportation process took several hours, but in the end, all the pallets were successfully sold, bringing our balance to just over $48,000. After that, I headed back to the farm, detached the trailer, and hooked up our harvester, as I had decided to sell it and replace it with a more powerful and efficient one. Since we had just enough money, I wasted no time and drove to the store. Upon arrival, I sold the old harvester and started looking for a new one. There was only one full-sized harvester we could afford, so I had no choice but to buy it. A header was also necessary, so I purchased that as well, though it was quite expensive. In total, we spent $37,000 on upgrading our harvesting equipment. Now we had a harvester that could efficiently work on large fields, which was certainly a big improvement. I hopped into our new harvester and drove it to the fields, where we would soon begin collecting the canola. Once the harvester was in place, I had to return to the store to pick up the tractor. After retrieving it, I drove back to the farm, attached the trailer, and headed to the field. There, I switched to the harvester and finally began harvesting. The weather was perfect, making the work enjoyable. After completing the first lap around the field, I realized that hiring a worker to drive the tractor with the trailer and follow the harvester would be a great way to increase efficiency. This way, we could unload the harvested canola directly into the trailer, speeding up the process significantly. I extended the auger pipe and the worker positioned the tractor right under it. From there, I continued moving in circles around the field, and the canola was automatically unloaded into the trailer. The work progressed much faster this way, although at times the worker did some strange things. Still, everything went smoothly overall, and within 20 minutes the first field was fully harvested. I didn't expect it to be done so quickly, but I was pleased with the results. Without wasting time, I moved on to the second field and continued the harvest. Once the first trailer was completely filled, I decided to first fill the harvester's grain tank entirely. Then, when the harvester was overloaded, I switched to the tractor and drove to the selling point. For one fully loaded trailer, we received just over $16,000, which was a pleasant surprise. I hadn't expected such a high amount, which made me seriously consider continuing to plant canola on our fields, as it proved to be quite profitable. But for now, I needed to finish harvesting the current crop. Returning to the harvester, I drove under the auger and unloaded the remaining canola. In total, we ended up with 2.5 trailers of canola, which sold for just under $46,000. That was an impressive sum, especially considering the amount of work put in. After finishing the harvest, I parked all the equipment in its designated spots and went to rest, now just waiting for our planted trees to fully grow. While we waited, our greenhouses continued producing rice seedlings, and during this time, we managed to sell them for an impressive amount, $89,000. It was absolutely fantastic because we practically did nothing, yet the profit was quite substantial. The trees took a long time to grow, and only on the 93rd day of our survival did they finally mature. When I ran over to check them out, I was completely stunned by their size. They had grown to be massive. I hoped that selling these trees would bring in a lot of money. However, after taking a closer look, I realized that selling them whole would be extremely inconvenient. Because of their significant length, transporting them off our land would be difficult, and it would take a huge amount of time. So, I decided to head to the store and purchase a wood chipper to process the trees into wood chips, which I could then transport in the trailer straight to the selling point. I got into the tractor and drove to the store. There, I chose the cheapest wood chipper, which cost $38,000. I also bought a chainsaw so I could fell the trees and cut them into smaller pieces before loading them into the chipper. With all the necessary equipment ready, I returned to the farm and prepared to start working. Upon arrival, I set up the wood chipper near the trees, then grabbed the trailer and parked it close by. After that, I directed the chipper's unloading pipe straight into the trailer and started it up. Once everything was set, I began cutting down the trees. To make loading them into the chipper easier, I cut the trunks into smaller pieces and manually fed them into the processor. The wood chips immediately started flowing into the trailer at full speed, which was a great sight, and I kept working with even more enthusiasm. At the same time, I also removed the stumps right away to prevent them from becoming obstacles in the future. Once the first trailer was fully loaded, I got into the tractor and noticed that the fuel level was critically low. I needed to refuel urgently, but first, I decided to sell the loaded wood chips. I drove to the selling point and began unloading. However, to my disappointment, I only received $4,000 for a full trailer of wood chips. Honestly, this was a bit disappointing. We had cut down quite a few trees, yet the earnings from it turned out to be rather low. But there was nothing I could do, so I continued working. Before that, I stopped by the store, bought a fuel barrel, and refueled the tractor. Then I returned to the trees and resumed processing them. By evening, I had finished the work, and our balance had reached almost $70,000. Of course, I was disappointed. I didn't even manage to cover the cost of the equipment used for processing the trees. But after such a long and exhausting day, I didn't want to think about it anymore. So I parked all the equipment in its place and went to rest, ready to continue developing the farm with renewed energy. The next morning, I decided to plant canola on our fields once again, since it had proven to be highly profitable. As always, I started by cultivating the land to prepare it for seeding. Everything went according to plan, and by the afternoon, I had finished fertilizing the freshly planted canola. After that, I took a break and waited for the next day. In the morning, I checked the weather forecast and saw that a strong hurricane was expected by noon. Of course, working in such extreme weather wouldn't make sense, so I decided to wait out the storm and rest until it was over. The next day, I realized it was time for a major reconstruction of our farm. We had accumulated too much equipment, and it no longer fit under the existing shelters. So, my first task was to build new, spacious sheds that could accommodate all our machinery. I had already chosen a location. They would be placed right next to our greenhouses, as there was still some free space there. I built 2 new sheds, each costing $10,000. I believe this will be enough to store all our current equipment. After that, I worked on improving the farm's layout. I decided to pave the area around the sheds with concrete to make access more convenient. This took some time, but in the end, the farm looked much cleaner, more organized, and functional. Next, I started moving our equipment. I sold the old shelters and began relocating all the machinery to the new, spacious sheds. Now, every tractor, harvester, and other equipment had its own designated space, and I no longer had to worry about a lack of storage. To improve visibility at night, I installed powerful lamps near the sheds, ensuring full illumination of the entire area. Now, even during nighttime, work could continue smoothly without fear of darkness. The next task was to create a dedicated storage area for fertilizers. We had accumulated a lot of barrels with herbicides and fertilizers, and leaving them out in the open wasn't the best idea. So, I built a new small shed specifically for storing all our consumable materials, both the ones we already had and any future supplies. After finishing construction, I moved all fertilizers and herbicides into the new storage, making our warehouse space much more organized. Then I focused on improving the roads. The old road to the store was inconvenient and slowed down transportation, so I built a new concrete road that significantly reduced travel time and made store trips much more comfortable. But the most important purchase of the day was a new house, which cost $45,000. I placed the house at the very center of the farm, making it the focal point of our homestead. After setting it up, I immediately fenced it off with a brand new fence, paved clean pathways around it, and decorated the surrounding area with trees and bushes. Now, the farm looked even more refined, comfortable and well organized, perfect for both living and working. I had finally completed all the necessary improvements to the farm, including creating convenient access roads and fencing the entire area. Now we had a truly beautiful, organized, and functional farm. All the equipment was neatly stored under the sheds in a designated area, which not only protected it from bad weather, but also kept everything in order. We had a greenhouse section where rice seedlings were grown. This provided us with a steady income, requiring very little effort on our part. In addition, we had 2 small fields currently planted with canola, a highly profitable crop that I planned to continue cultivating. While inspecting the area, I noticed that yesterday's hurricanes had knocked down a tree near the field. It wasn't a big problem, but in the future, I would need to monitor the surrounding vegetation more closely. We also had a tree growing area, and I thought about planting a few new species soon to test their profitability. For efficient storage, we now had a dedicated warehouse where we kept fertilizer bags, herbicides, and other essential resources. And from the very beginning of our farm's development, we had a silage pit, which would soon need to be refilled again. At the very center of the farm stood our new house, which had truly become a cozy retreat. Next to it, I created a small garden, set up a gazebo, and planted flowers to make the space even more inviting. Of course, the entire home area was fenced off to ensure privacy and security. The house also had 2 spacious garages, and I planned to buy a personal vehicle in the future to make getting around the farm much faster. And that's how our farm turned out after 100 days. I hope that even more opportunities for growth await us in the future. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.